In most cases, we won't have to build our own data frames. Rather, what we'll do is import datasets. Three of the most common file types that we'll work with are .csv files, which are comma-separated files, .txt files, which are text files, and .xlsx, or the older version .xls, which are Microsoft Excel files. We can easily import these and assign them to objects in R with slightly different methods in code. First, let's go over the .csv file, which will be the most common file that we'll be using. So if I open up our CSV file using Microsoft Excel, we'll see that it's a common Excel sheet. So we have our observations moving down in rows, and we have our variables moving across in columns. Now if I open up the same file using a text editor, we'll see here that all of the data are separated by commas. So we have the header up here, which are each of the variables, and we have, again, each of the observations moving down in rows. And each of the observations aligned to the variables are separated by commas moving across. Now what we need to remember is that every time we import a data file, we're going to have to assign it to an object. In most cases, R will recognize the data that we're importing is a data frame, and it'll coerce it as such. So the data set we're going to be working with is called self-evaluation. So let's import our self-evaluation data frame. Let's assign it to an object called SE1, which stands for self-evaluation. For didactic purposes, we'll assign the number 1 because I'm going to show you several ways in which we can upload the data. And this will be our first method. So the function we're going to use here is read.csv. Now in general, what R wants to do is to assign a file path the same way we assign our working directory to this file. However, here what I like to use is the file.choose function. So what the file.choose function will do is it'll prompt a box, which will show all of the data files in our working directory. And here what we can do is just double click on the file we want to use, and it'll import it and store it into the object SE1. The reason why I like to use the file.choose function is it allows me to double check the data file that we're using to make sure it's the correct one. So if you remember from the file that we looked at, there was a header. So in order to import it the right way, we need to indicate that the header is equal to true. Okay, so what we can do is run this code. It brings up our working directory. We see the self-evaluation.csv file that we want to work on. We'll double click that, and we'll see the data is now stored in the object SE1. It contains 159 observations or 159 rows across 6 variables or 6 columns. Now if we want, we can click on the title. It'll open up a new tab, and it shows us a clean version similar to the Excel file that we just looked at, where we see 159 observations moving down and the 6 variables moving across. Note that we use the point and click here on the title to open that up. If we want to use code to do that, we can use the view function with a capital V. We could put the object that we stored the data frame in, and it'll open up the same new tab. Okay, now we can also use another command, which is the read.table function. So let's store this in a new object. We'll store it in SE1A. We'll use the read.table function. Here we'll use the same file.choose method. We'll indicate again that the header is equal to true. And the difference here, because we haven't indicated that it's a CSV file, we need to add one extra argument. We'll use the sep argument, and we'll indicate within single quotes that it's separated by a comma. Okay, let's again run this code. It'll bring up the box again. We'll click on the .csv file, and we'll see here that the data has been read in again into object SE1A, again with 159 observations across 6 variables. Again, to double check, we can double click on this or use the view function, and we'll see that's the same data frame that we saw earlier. Okay, so now what if we're given a tab delimited text file? We can use similar code with a slight variation. Let's store this in an object called SE2. And the function we're going to use here is the read.delim function. Again, we'll use the file.choose method, and we'll indicate that the header is true. If we run this code, it'll bring up the box again. Here we want to import the .txt file. We see that it's imported into the object SE2. Again, if we click on the title, we'll see that we brought in the same data file. Now similarly, even with the .txt file, we can also use the read.table function to import the data. So let's store this in an object called SE2A. We'll use the read.table function. Again, we'll use the file choose option. We'll set the header to true. Now earlier when we imported the .csv file, we had to indicate that the data was separated by a comma. Here, we're going to indicate a separation by a backward slash and a T. Again, I'll run this code. It'll bring up the box. We'll select the .txt file. It's been read into object SE2A. We'll click on SE2A. And again, we have the same data that we saw earlier. Now the last file type that we can bring in is the .xlsx or the .xls Microsoft Excel extension. Now bringing in this type of data is a little bit tricky, which is why I typically don't use Microsoft Excel files. Generally what I'll do is I'll resave the file as a .csv file. But here for didactic purposes, we'll import a Microsoft Excel file. So the first thing we have to do is load in a package. And that package is called readxl. So I've already installed it on my computer, so I'll just use the library function and I'll load in the readxl package. Now what we'll do is we'll load this into an object called SE3. And then from that package, we'll use the read.excel function. Now what we have to do is assign the file path to this file within the function. Now note, we could have done this with all the other options, but instead we chose to use the file.choose function. So the file is currently sitting in my working directory, so I know that this is the file path to that file. I'll run the code. We'll see that it's now stored in object SE3. If we click on this again, we'll see the same data frame.